The wind howled across the empty plains like a wounded beast, tearing through the cracks of the small cabin nestled at the edge of the Wyoming frontier. Snow had fallen for 3 days straight, swallowing the landscape in a white silence so deep it felt like the world had stopped breathing. Inside, a fire burned low in the hearth, the only witness to the two souls huddled together for warmth. Clara and Jacob. He was a ranch hand, rough round the edges, with eyes as gray as the winter sky. She was the daughter of the landowner, raised with lace gloves and Sunday lessons. Yet she'd chosen to stay behind with him when everyone else fled the coming blizzard. Outside, their horses were buried beneath drifts, the barn creaking under the snow's weight. Inside, their hearts found warmth in each other's nearness. Jacob fixed the fire with trembling hands, whispering, "We'll make it through." Clara, she smiled faintly, her face glowing in the firelight. "As long as we're together, I don't fear the cold." The storm raged harder the next morning. The cabin door had frozen shut overnight, and the world beyond the frosted windows looked like a white abyss. Jacob rose early, his breath fogging the air as he gathered what little supplies they had left. A sack of flour, a jar of beans, and half a pound of dried meat. Clara wrapped herself in his old coat, far too big for her, smelling of leather and smoke. She moved closer to him, her fingers brushing his as she handed him a cup of weak coffee. "You should rest," she said softly, but he only shook his head. "Not until I fix that roof beam. If it breaks, we're done for, together." They worked through the freezing morning, her holding the lantern as he climbed up to hammer the beam into place. Each strike of the hammer echoed through the snowy silence, a promise that they wouldn't surrender. When he came down, shivering, she wrapped her arms round him, pressing her cheek against his chest. "You're my warmth," she whispered. He smiled, his rough hands tracing her jaw. "And you're my reason." By the third day, the snow had sealed them completely inside. They burned broken furniture to keep the fire alive, and the scent of smoke filled the tiny space. Outside, wolves howled in the distance, their cries haunting yet strangely beautiful. Clara sat by the fire, mending Jacob's torn glove, while he carved a small wooden pendant for her. The silence between them was no longer awkward, it was sacred, filled with the quiet rhythm of survival and affection. "I never thought I'd fall in love out here," she murmured, watching the flames dance. Jacob looked up, his face softening. "You think this is love?" he teased gently. She smiled. "If freezing, starving, and praying with someone isn't love, then what is?" He laughed quietly, pulling her closer. "Then I reckon we're the richest. Folks in the West." Snow pressed harder against the windows, and the fire dimmed, but their hearts beat steady, like a song that refused to fade. That night, Clara woke to the sound of the roof creaking. A beam had shifted under the weight of the snow. Jacob sprang up, pulling on his coat and boots. "Stay back," he ordered, his voice steady but his eyes full of fear. She watched as he climbed into the loft with a lantern and a rope, pushing against the heavy timber. The whole cabin groaned as if alive. Snow slipped through the cracks, falling onto his shoulders, melting into his hair. "Jacob," she cried, her voice trembling. "It's too dangerous." He looked down, his breath visible in the cold air. "If I don't, the whole place'll come down on us." With one last heave, he wedged the beam into place, his muscles straining, and for a moment, the world went still. Then silence. He climbed down, exhausted, his hands raw. Clara threw her arms round him, tears streaking her cheeks. "You'd risk your life for a cabin." He smiled weakly. "Not for the cabin, for you." The storm finally began to ease on the 5th morning. Pale sunlight broke through the clouds, turning the world into a field of diamonds. Clara stepped outside for the first time in days, her breath catching at the sight of endless white stretching to the horizon. Jacob joined her, wrapping his arms round her shoulders. "Looks like the world's been reborn," he said softly. She leaned back against him. "Then let's be part of it." They walked to the barn, digging out the door with shovels, laughing when they stumbled into the snow. The horses neighed weakly inside, still alive. Jacob rubbed their necks, whispering thanks under his breath. That night, they sat by the fire again. But now the warmth wasn't just survival. It was peace. Clara rested her head on his chest. When the snow melts, she said, I want to build something real, not just walls, but a life. Jacob kissed her hair. Then we'll start with tomorrow. A week later, the mail rider came through. The first human voice they'd heard in nearly 10 days. He brought letters from town, including one for Clara from her father. She read it in silence, her eyes glistening. He says the ranch is lost, she whispered. The cattle froze. He wants me to come back east. Jacob's face hardened. And will you? She looked at him, torn between duty and love. The cabin creaked as wind whispered through the cracks. Finally, she folded the letter and tossed it into the fire. No, she said firmly. My life is here, with you. Jacob stared at her, speechless, before taking her hand. You sure about that? Life out here ain't easy, she smiled. Neither is life without love. The flames crackled as the paper burned, curling into ash. Outside, the snow fell softly again, but this time it didn't feel cold. Spring came slow, dripping from the trees and whispering through the thawing grass. The river broke free of its ice, and the first wildflowers bloomed near the cabin. Clara tended a small garden, her hands covered in dirt and hope. Jacob built a new fence, his shirt damp with sweat, his heart lighter than ever. One afternoon, as golden light filled the sky, he knelt beside her and handed her a small wooden box. Inside lay a silver ring, rough but shining. "Ain't much," he said softly, "but it's made from the same metal as the barrel of my first revolver. Thought it might protect you better than I can." Clara's eyes filled with tears. "It's perfect," she whispered, and he slipped it onto her finger. The wind carried their laughter across the prairie, where the snow had once buried everything. That winter returned harsh and cruel, testing every promise they had made. Supplies ran low, and sickness crept into their bones. Clara fell ill first, her skin pale as the snow outside. Jacob refused to leave her side. He fed her spoonfuls of broth, sang to her softly, and prayed in the dark. "You saved me once," she murmured weakly. "Now save yourself." He shook his head, holding her hand. "I'm not leaving you, not ever." For days, he fought against the storm and her fever, until finally, her breathing eased, her hand tightening in his. When dawn came, she opened her eyes and smiled faintly. "See," she whispered, "even the snow can't take us." He kissed her forehead, tears freezing on his cheeks. Outside, the sun broke through the clouds again, painting the snow with gold. Years passed. The cabin grew stronger with every season, rebuilt and repaired by their love. They became known to travelers as the couple who survived the white death sometimes. When the wind carried distant howls, Clara would smile and press Jacob's hand. "Remember that night?" She'd ask, "How could I forget?" He'd say, their hair turned silver, their hands lined with time, but their love never dimmed. Every winter, they lit the same fire, the one that had kept them alive so long ago, and shared stories of the storm that started it all. Life in the West was never easy, but for them, it was never empty either. Love had turned the wilderness into a home. On a quiet winter morning many years later, Jacob awoke to find the cabin silent again, not with fear, but peace. Clara lay beside him, her face serene, a faint smile still on her lips. The fire had burned down to embers. He held her hand, whispering, "You kept your promise, my love." Snow fell outside, soft and endless, covering the world in white once more. When neighbors found him days later, he was still sitting beside her, his head resting on her shoulder, both of them finally at rest. The snow never stopped falling, but in the hush of that lonely cabin, their story remained. Two souls bound forever by love, fire, and the endless white of the Old West.